In a farmhouse in Minnesota, on a shelf above the kitchen table, there is a dictionary. It is not a remarkable book to look at. Small, leather-bound, the spine cracked and repaired more than once with glue and thread. But if you open it, you will find, in the margins of nearly every page, two different kinds of handwriting. One is small and neat, the hand of a woman who learned to write in a Virginia schoolroom. The other is larger, slower, and more careful, the hand of a man who learned English the way some people learn to swim, late, badly, and only because someone was patient enough to stand in the water with him. This is the story of how both hands came to be in the same book. In the winter of 1876, in a rented room above a dry goods store in Richmond, Virginia, a woman named Ruth Calloway sat at a small table with a needle in one hand and a petticoat in the other, mending a hem for a woman she had never met and would never meet, which was, by that point, the way most of her days went. She was 31 years old. She had been a seamstress for 6 years, since her husband James had died at Petersburg in the last months of the war, and she had been alone for all of them, which was longer, she had recently begun to notice, than she had been married. The room was cold. It was always cold in January, and Ruth had stopped minding it the way one stops minding a bad neighbor. Not because the problem improved, but because complaining about it required energy she had decided to spend elsewhere. She finished the hem, set the petticoat aside, and picked up the next piece from the pile, and it was during this motion, the ordinary, automatic motion of reaching for the next thing, that she noticed for the first time that she could not remember the last time she had reached for something that was not the next piece of mending. That evening, Ruth did something she had not done in 6 years of widowhood. She bought a newspaper, sat down at her table, and read the matrimonial column, not because anyone had suggested it, and not because she had been thinking about it, but because the pile of mending was finished, and the evening was long, and she found, quite suddenly, that she did not want to spend another one of them sitting in a cold room with nothing in her hands. The column held 23 advertisements. Most were from men in the eastern states, merchants, clerks, widowers with children, written in the kind of careful English that suggested the writer had spent a good deal of time making sure he sounded like exactly the sort of man a woman ought to want. Near the bottom of the page, Ruth found one that was not like the others at all. It read, "I know 40 words in English. I have used 11 of them to write this. If you can be patient with a man who means more than he can say, I would like to hear from you. Farmer, Minnesota. E. Lindgren." Ruth counted the words. There were 37 in the notice, which meant he had either learned a few more since he started writing it, or he had been modest about the 40, or someone had helped him with the parts he couldn't manage. She read it again. A man who means more than he can say. She had known men who said more than they meant. She had married one, briefly and happily, and buried him, and spent 6 years afterward in a room where no one said anything at all. She folded the paper carefully and set it on the table, beside the needle, and sat for a long while before she picked up her pen. Ruth's husband James had been 23 when he enlisted and 24 when he died, and Ruth had been 25 and married for 14 months. She remembered him clearly, which was both a comfort and a particular kind of weight, because clarity, she had learned, did not fade the way people said it would. It simply became a thing she carried, the way she carried her needle case, always present, always in the same pocket. After the war, she had gone back to the sewing she had learned from her mother, and she had done it well enough to keep the room and feed herself and put aside, over 6 years, $87, which she kept in a tin under the floorboard, and which represented, as far as she could calculate, approximately 11,000 hems. She was not unhappy, but she had begun to notice in the last year that the silence of her room had changed from the kind that rests a person to the kind that simply sits there, taking up the space where something else ought to be. She wrote to E. Lindgren that night. She wrote plainly, because she did not know how much English he would be able to read, and she chose her words with the same care she used when cutting cloth. Nothing wasted, nothing extra, every piece doing exactly the work it needed to do. She told him her age, and that she was a widow, and that she sewed for a living. She told him that she had read a great many advertisements, and that his was the only one that had made her count the words. She signed it Ruth Calloway and posted it the next morning, and tried, for most of that day, not to think about whether a man with 40 words of English could read a letter written by a woman who had used considerably more. Erik Lindgren read Ruth's letter at his kitchen table in Kandiyohi County, Minnesota, on a Tuesday evening in February, with a Norwegian English dictionary open beside him and a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow. He was 33 years old, broad and fair-haired, with the kind of quietness that people sometimes mistook for shyness, but which was, in fact, simply the quietness of a man who had spent most of his life in a language that was not the one being spoken around him. He had come from Norway at 19, alone, with a dictionary, a letter of introduction to a family in St. Paul that he never used, and a conviction, inherited from his father, that land was the only thing worth crossing an ocean for. He had homesteaded his quarter section 7 years earlier, built the house himself over 2 summers, and had by now 160 acres of wheat, a barn, a cow, 14 chickens, and a dog named Purr, after his grandfather, who understood Norwegian commands perfectly and English ones not at all, which Erik considered a sign of good judgment. He had placed the advertisement himself with help from the postmaster, who had corrected his spelling and suggested gently that 40 words might be an undercount. Erik had received 3 replies. The first was from a woman in Illinois, who had written 4 pages of closely spaced script that Erik had spent an entire evening trying to read with, his dictionary, and had understood perhaps a third of. The second was from a woman who asked, in her second sentence, how much land he owned, and nothing else. Ruth's letter was the shortest of the 3, and the only one he understood completely on the first reading. She had written it, he realized, in small words, not simple words, careful ones. Words chosen so that a man with a dictionary could follow them without losing the thread. He read it twice, and then he sat for a while with the dictionary closed and the letter open, and thought that this was a woman who understood what it meant to make yourself understood, which was not the same thing as speaking clearly, and which was, he suspected, a great deal harder. He wrote back that evening, slowly, 1 word at a time, checking each one. It took him 2 hours to write 9 lines. The letters that followed, over the next 5 months, were unlike anything either of them had written before, because they had to be. Erik's letters were short, plain, and built from the words he knew, which meant they were, by necessity, honest in a way that longer letters rarely managed. He could not dress up a thought or hide behind a phrase. He wrote what he meant, or he did not write at all. I planted wheat today. It was cold. Purr sat in the field and watched me like I was doing it wrong. The cow as well. I think of your letter often. I do not have the word for what I mean. I will find it. Ruth wrote back in the same careful, measured way, matching her vocabulary to his the way a musician matches tempo to a slower partner, not dumbing down, but finding the rhythm where both of them could meet. She told him about the fabric shop where she bought her thread, and about a cardinal that came to her windowsill every morning, and about how sewing, when done well, was mostly a matter of patience, which she suspected farming was too. She did not use the word loneliness, but she wrote around it, the way water writes around a stone, and Erik, reading her letters with his dictionary, understood what she was not saying as clearly as what she was. By the 4th month, Erik's letters had grown from 9 lines to nearly a full page, and Ruth had begun, without quite noticing, to look forward to the particular pleasure of reading them. The small surprise of a word used almost correctly, the careful way he built a sentence the way a man might build a fence, 1 post at a time, checking each one before moving to the next. There was no obstacle to speak of. Ruth's work could go anywhere a needle could, and her landlord, when she gave notice, wished her well with the particular relief of a man who had been charging too little rent for too long, and was not sorry to find a tenant who could pay more. What gave her pause was not the journey or the man, but the sewing box she packed last, her mother's, rosewood, with a brass clasp, and the thought, holding it, that she was about to carry everything she had across 1,000 miles to live with a man she had never heard speak, in a language she did not know, on land she had never seen. She held the box for a long moment, and then she packed it, and that was that. The train took 5 days. Ruth watched Virginia give way to the wide middle of the country, the hills flattening, the sky growing larger, until Minnesota appeared, pale, enormous, and so flat that the horizon looked like a line drawn with a ruler. She was afraid. In the quiet way, she was afraid of most things, which was to name the fear and then set it beside her, like a piece of mending she would get to later. She was afraid that a man who meant more than he could say might, in person, simply mean less than she had imagined. She was afraid that patience, which she had always considered her best quality, might not be enough to cross the distance between two people who did not share a language. Somewhere in western Minnesota, with the light going long and gold across fields that had no end, Ruth took his first letter from her bag and read it again, though by now she knew every word. I do not have the word for what I mean. I will find it. She thought about what it would be like to live beside a man who was always reaching for a word he did not have. And she found, sitting there with the fields going by, that she understood this better than she had expected to, because she had spent 6 years in a room where the words she needed, not English words, just the ordinary words a person says to another person at the end of a day, had no one to be said to, which was, she thought, its own kind of silence, and possibly worse than not having the words at all. The Kandiyohi depot was a platform and a grain elevator, and when Ruth stepped down, the first thing she saw was a man standing very still at the far end, holding his hat in both hands the way a man holds something he is not sure what to do with, and beside him a gray dog, sitting with the particular alertness of an animal who has been told to behave and is considering the request. He was taller than she had imagined, and fairer, and when he saw her he took one step forward and then stopped, as though he had rehearsed the first part but not the second. "Mrs. Calloway," he said very carefully. "Mr. Lindgren," she said. A pause. The light on the platform was the kind she would come to know well. Wide and gold and so clear it made everything look closer than it was. Erik reached into his coat and took out a small leather-bound book, his dictionary, and held it out to her, not as a gift exactly, but as an offering the way a man might offer a hand. "For you," he said, "for us. So we can," he stopped, searched, "so we can find the words." Ruth took the dictionary and felt its weight, and understood all at once that this man had just handed her the only tool he had for making himself known in the world, and that this was not a small thing, and that she would need to be very careful with it. "That is the best gift," she said slowly, clearly, meeting his eyes, "anyone has ever given me." Purr, the dog, who had been considering the request to behave for as long as he could reasonably be expected to, broke ranks and pressed his nose into Ruth with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. And Erik said something in Norwegian that Ruth did not understand, but that sounded, from the tone, like an apology that was not entirely sincere. The house was small, clean, and built with the kind of care that suggested the man who built it had thought carefully about where the light would fall in winter. Ruth noticed on the first evening that Erik had placed 2 chairs at the kitchen table, and that between them, in the center, he had put a second dictionary, identical to the one he had given her at the station. "One for you," he said, pointing. "One for me. We meet in the middle." That first week set the pattern for everything that followed. Each evening after supper, they sat at the kitchen table with the dictionary between them, and Ruth would read a passage, sometimes from a newspaper, sometimes from a book of poems she had brought, and Erik would stop her when he did not know a word, and she would find it in the dictionary and show him. And he would say it slowly, trying the shape of it, and she would nod or correct him, and Purr would sigh under the table with the weary patience of a dog who had heard all of this before and found it tedious. Erik, in turn, taught her Norwegian words, not systematically but as they came up. The word for snow, for bread, for the particular kind of light that comes through a window in winter. The word for home, which in Norwegian, he told her, carried a weight that the English word did not quite hold. Ruth wrote each one in the margin of her dictionary, in her small, neat hand, and Erik wrote the English words in his larger, slower one. And the dictionaries, over the months and years, filled with 2 languages growing toward each other from opposite margins. "He means more than he can say," Ruth thought one evening, watching him work through a sentence about the wheat, stopping twice to find a word, refusing to let her finish it for him. He had always meant more than he could say. The words were just catching up. The proposal came on a winter evening, 3 months after her arrival, at the kitchen table with the dictionary open between them and Purr asleep on Ruth's feet. Erik had been quiet for longer than usual, which Ruth had learned to recognize as the particular quiet that came before he attempted something difficult in English. I have been. He stopped, looked at the dictionary, did not open it. I have been trying to find the right word. For what I want to ask you, I have looked in the book. It is not there. What is the word in Norwegian? Ruth asked. He said it. She did not understand it, but she understood the way he said it, which was enough. I would like to marry you, Ruth, he said then, in English, each word placed carefully, like stones across a stream. If you are willing. I know I do not have all the words yet, but I mean them. You have the ones that matter, Ruth said. Yes. They were married the following month. In the small Lutheran church in town, with 4 neighboring families as witnesses and a minister who conducted the ceremony in English and then, at Erik's quiet request, repeated the vows in Norwegian so that both languages were in the room. Per waited outside the church in the snow and barked once, sharply. At the exact moment the minister pronounced them married, which everyone agreed was either perfect timing or a coincidence, depending on how one felt about dogs. The years that followed were full in the way a dictionary is full, one word at a time, until the pages hold more than they were made for. By the second year, Erik's English had grown from 40 words to what Ruth estimated was several hundred. Though he still spoke slowly and carefully, the way he did everything, and still reached, sometimes, for a word that was not there, and still looked at Ruth in those moments with the expression she had come to think of as the look. The one that meant I mean more than I can say, and I know you know it. By the third year, Ruth had learned enough Norwegian to understand most of what Erik said to Per, which was, she discovered, a great deal more than he said to anyone else, and which consisted largely of philosophical observations about the weather, the wheat, and the general unreliability of chickens. Their first child was born in 1879, a son, and a daughter followed in 1882. Both children grew up bilingual, switching between English and Norwegian without effort, the way children do, and both of them learned to read from the same dictionary, which by then had so many marginal notes that the original text was nearly hidden beneath 2 overlapping hands. The grasshopper years hit Kandiyohi County hard, and the winter of 1881 was the worst anyone could remember. But Ruth's sewing, mending, alterations, and eventually a small dressmaking business she ran from the kitchen, brought in enough during the lean months that the farm survived when others did not. Erik never said much about this, but Ruth noticed that he had begun, in his careful way, to introduce her to neighbors, not as his wife but as Mrs. Lindgren, who keeps the books and the needle, which she understood was, in his language and in any language, a form of pride. Per grew old and gray and spent his last years sleeping in a patch of sun by the kitchen door, and when he died, Erik buried him beside the fence line and stood there for a while without speaking, which Ruth, by then, understood was not silence but grief in Norwegian, which looked, she had learned, exactly like grief in English. The dictionary on the kitchen shelf grew thick with years. Its spine was repaired 3 times, twice with glue, once with thread from Ruth's sewing box, which she considered appropriate, since the book had by then become as much hers as his, and held, in its margins, a record of 2 people learning each other's language 1 word at a time, which was, she thought, not so different from learning each other. Erik Lindgren died in the autumn of 1914, at the age of 71, at the kitchen table, with the dictionary open in front of him. He had been looking up a word, though Ruth never found out which one, and a cup of coffee untouched beside it. Ruth was in the next room. She came in when the silence changed, not the ordinary silence of a man reading, but the other kind, the kind that has no breath in it. And she sat with him a long while, holding his hand, which was still warm and rough and familiar. And she did not cry then, though she would later, many times, in the small, precise way she did most things. In the weeks afterward, going through his desk, Ruth found very little. Erik had not been a man who kept things. But in the bottom drawer, beneath his homestead papers and a photograph of his parents he had carried from Norway, she found a single sheet, folded twice, in his careful handwriting. It was a draft of his advertisement, the one she had answered, written out 3 times. The first 2 versions were longer, with more English clearly labored over, full of corrections and crossed-out words. The third version, the one he had sent, was the short one she knew by heart. I know 40 words in English. I have used 11 of them to write this. If you can be patient with a man who means more than he can say, I would like to hear from you." Below it, added in different ink, years later, in handwriting that was steadier and more confident than the draft above it. The handwriting of a man who had, by then, learned a great many more words was a single line. She was patient. She taught me the words. But she had understood me before I had any of them, and I have come to believe that is what the word love means in any language, though I did not know that word either when I began. Ruth folded the paper along its old creases and put it back, and closed the drawer. She lived 9 more years on the farm, and she was not unhappy in them. The dictionary stayed on its shelf. Her daughter's children, when they visited, would sometimes take it down and open it, and find, in the margins, 2 kinds of handwriting growing toward each other from opposite sides of every page, and they would ask what the words meant, and Ruth would tell them one at a time, the way she had always done. And in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table where 2 chairs had always faced each other with a book between them, Ruth thought that Erik Lindgren had been exactly what his advertisement promised, a man who meant more than he could say, and that she had spent 38 years listening to what he meant, and that this had turned out, after everything, to be more than enough, and possibly the only kind of conversation worth having.